I was just saying, good afternoon and thank you for being here. This session concludes the Lanark Reading Group meeting for this year, as Peter just mentioned. So this year, I am glad to introduce our invited speaker and knowledgeable theologian in decolonial theory, Dr. Rufus Burnett. Dr. Burnett is assistant professor in systematic theology at Fordham University. He earned his doctorate in systematic theology at Duquesne University in 2016. Professor Burnett's research interests include liberation theologies, decolonial theology, the theory of coloniality, sound studies, the blues, and African American studies. As a constructive theologian, Rufus explores the theological insight of groups that respond to domination through the creative use of cultural production. His first book, published just last year in 2018, entitled Decolonizing Revelation, a spatial reading of the blues, uncovers blues music as an epistemic and cosmological framework that works to delink the Christian imagination of Revelation from oppressive foreclosures within nationalism, Christian denominations, race, class, sexuality, and ethnocentrism. Some here today have read the first chapter of the book in connection with the Lanark Reading Group, and riffing off that first chapter, Rufus will discuss for the more general audience theology in light of what decolonial theorist Walter Mignolo refers to as the colonial difference. So Rufus, welcome. I look forward to hearing the reflection you have to share with us today.
Thank you so much for those very warm and many undeserved words. You know, when one writes a book, you know, it's pretty much a selfish task. And so it's no small matter to me that the reading group has invited me to talk about this. I see this nexus between decoloniality and theology as important and maybe even a crucial conversation for the future of theology and Christian praxis. So while I'm going to speak specifically to the reading group, it's my hope that my reflections will invite questions and comments that are also germane to our conversation about gangs in Central America. There will be some moments when will make specific reference to the ideas in the chapter that some may have read, but my overall goal is to situate the task taken up in decolonizing Revelation. So I just want to make three distinct moves, and I hope we can have a really lively conversation afterwards. All right, so the first move is somewhat autobiographical, right? It is to speak about the preconditions for my practice of decolonial theology. In this section on the preconditions, I'll briefly reflect on some of the key questions that I've inherited from the communities and intellectuals that have led me to this constructive moment represented in decolonizing Revelation. Right? The second move is to speak about what it means to accept, borrowing some phraseology that should sound familiar to the group, right? What it means to accept the coloniality of power as a theological challenge. That is the Peruvian sociologist Anibal Quijano's theory, right? And how Anibal Quijano has assisted me is I'm trying to push with and beyond thinkers in the study of African American religion and Black theology in particular. And I want to put an asterisk there because Black theology is usually dominated by males based off the critique of womanist and feminist theologians. So what I'm saying is African Americans that do theology. When I say Black theology, I don't mean the traditional phrase Black theology, although I use it sometimes to shorten it. So the third and last move will be to speak about how a spatial reading of the blues, which is the subtitle of the book, provides a foundation for doing a, emphasis on a, not the, a decolonial theology. In this section, I'll be reflecting specifically on the blues lifeway with the work of critical geographer, passed away in 2008, unfortunately, Clyde Woods, who considers the blues as an arrested development, or as I see it, an emergent cosmological framework for thinking about God's self-disclosure in history. So in shorthand for that, just think about the pre-theological stuff that theology grabs onto to make itself, to mediate itself in the world. So let us begin with the first move, the preconditions. So I think it's important to clarify my path, or an old liberation theology phrase, to name my social location somewhat. And that has led me to kind of a non-traditional starting point for theology. As an undergraduate at Xavier University in New Orleans, Louisiana, I was introduced to the discipline of theology by reading thinkers like Gustavo Gutierrez, James Cone. Gustavo was the first theologian I ever read. No lie. James Cone, Rosemary Radford Ruther, Dolores Williams, John Sabrino, just to name some, right? The reasoning of the department was that they wanted to teach theology in a way that would impact the lives of students at the only historically Black Catholic institution in the country. That's still correct, right? Yep. So as such, they wanted theology to be relevant to the experience of Black Americans as well as the planetary realities of oppression and impoverishment. This liberationist approach was covered in a mandatory undergraduate course. Now get this seductive title, Introduction to Theology. Liberation theology was theology at Xavier. In addition to the theologians I mentioned, we also studied some scholars of Black religion, namely Joseph Washington and Charles Long. They're not familiar, but I'll introduce them a little bit later. So when I was not miserably failing at my attempt to be a biology pre-med major, I was spending a lot of time with the professors and students, and this guy, of the theology department. In addition to the on-campus investigations, my thirst for thinking about liberation was inspired by a local group of poets, musical artists, and community activists that were organized under the title Pizzazz Productions. Pizzazz hosted weekly poetry nights that kind of became my second church. Right? The topics of the poems covered everything from failures of the New Orleans public school system, mass incarceration, gang violence, Black American self-determination, and of course that famed poetic theme, love. My experience with Pizzazz was one of the first places that I became aware of the different representations of what is ubiquitously termed as Black life. Right? Pizzazz Productions displayed the diversity of Blackness and greatly expanded my sense of self that was previously situated in a very small Baptist church in Gulfport, Mississippi, right? That was a part of the National Baptist Convention. Some of you know Martin Luther King. They disagreed with him. They went away. He went this way, right? It was in my conversations with the weekly poetry night participants that I was exposed to the thought also of Frantz Fanon and other thinkers in the Black radical tradition. In addition to my experiences with Pizzazz, I spent several years in New Orleans public school system as an after-school program coordinator. My encounter with the abysmal conditions of New Orleans public schools allowed me to put the meat on the bones of the realities that were infused into the words of the poets. Lastly, and this explains my interest in the sonic or blues, I was introduced to the New Orleans jazz community through my brief tenure as the drummer for the Xavier University Jazz Band. I don't say that much anymore, but on the weekends, I often was invited to gigs to sit in with some of the city's most respected local musicians. And it laid me bare, so to speak, before the cultural heritage that was so integral to the blues idiom. Right? These experiences of sound and struggle left me looking to theology to answer several questions. The first question, prompted by Joseph Washington, is kind of a strange question, but here it is. Right? He asked in one of his articles on Black religion, whether or not Black Americans are Christian. This is an African American asking this question to other African Americans. Right? Washington contended that it was racial injustice rather than Christian theological positions that were the motivating factors for joining Black Americans together in autonomous Christian congregations. So you think about the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Baptist Church, and there's a couple of others, right? And the second thinker that was influential is Dolores Williams. Some of you may know her as a womanist theologian, right? She critiqued Black theologians, which I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, right, for their reception of substitutionary atonement. Now, of course, theologians are representing communities. I don't want to see this just as an intellectual project, but they're ingrained in the communities and they're following them on this, right? So she critiqued the reception of substitutionary atonement and the exodus of Israel as a parallel trope to the Black American experience of suffering. In her text, Sisters in the Wilderness, Williams determined that the violence of the cross and the suffering of the Exodus were redundant symbols to those who innocently suffer at the intersection of racial and sexual oppressions. Williams impressed upon me that God's activity in history could be read in a more relevant analogy if one looked to illumine, for instance, how Jesus' ministry paralleled the generative, creative work of Black Americans who reimagined new foundations for the sacred in the new world, right? Lastly, and most formative for me is the question taken up by Charles Long, history of religion scholar out of the University of Chicago, which is the question of what is Black religion? Another strange question, right? Charles Long was convinced that the advent of Black theology as a discipline was an expression rather than the expression of the primal mood of Black American religion. For Long, Black American religion is shaped by three characterizing perspectives that also constitute for him the important symbols of Black religion. The first one, Africa as a historical reality and image. Secondly, the involuntary presence of the Black community in America. And third, the experience and symbol of God and the religious experience of Blacks. This fascinated me most importantly because of Long and his ability to ask the question that these perspectives beg. Why were African Americans not seen as religious subjects? Right? The short story here is in the middle of the civil rights movement, people in the history of religions were asking Long ethical questions about what was happening in the streets. And he said, we're historians of religions. Doesn't this have something to do with religion? Right? The understanding of what religion looks like. Right? So to answer this question, Long wrote this essay called The Primitive and the Civilized, the Locus of the Problem. Right? In this essay, he writes about the crisis of the ideology of civilization. He says, primitivism constitutes a pervasive influence in modern Western cultures on the learned as well as the popular level. The problem surrounding the usage of the term primitive as a proper designation for certain cultures, histories, and religions, certain youths in El Salvador, right, must therefore be seen as a crisis of the term civilization. This notion of the crisis in the term was a hermeneutical critique. Long isolated how the co-emergent ideas of both civilization and primitivism were more ideological than empirical. They didn't name anything, right? As such, right, it reflected a moment of false consciousness amongst those Europeans who used them to name things outside of themselves. This sense of false consciousness, Long argued, is religious in nature and was key in the makings of the West as nations under God and therefore against, right, and violently so-called primitive religions of the Americas and Africa. As Long saw it, the labeling of Christianity as civilized religion was most likely a trope for positively representing the religious sensibilities of an emerging bourgeois European class, right? So he names that this is an empirical othering that's internal to Europe, but when it moves past Europe, it has some problems. So this gets us to the second point, accepting the colonial power as a theological challenge. Decolonizing Revelation tries to recover the unique subjectivity of blues people. I'm trying to do theology with the insights, values, and worldviews implicit in blues music and the lives of those who created the genre at the turn of the 20th century in the US South. I'm choosing to construct because I think that the theology of Revelation, that is the theology that interprets God's disclosure in history, plays an integral role in, fortunately so, the underdevelopment of the Black Americans that I identify in the text as blues people. Decolonial theory, particularly Argentine thinker Walter Mignolo, Peruvian thinker Aníbal Quijano, Jamaican thinker Sylvia Wynter, has expanded my interpretive lens. Moving with and beyond Long, I want to do theology in a way that remains critical of how Christian principles have aided the matrix of power that emerged from the European colonies. Where Long wanted to expose how the study of religion reified the myth of civilization and primitivism, I wanted to show how the adoption of Christianity by Black Americans in some instances reified the colonial matrix of power. Let's talk about that in a second, right? Ironically, against Black Americans. Black Christians rendered the blues people as noble primitives, ripe for religious instruction, racial uplift, and participation in the modern project, the very project that put them in there in the first place. We can talk about that more in the discussion. According to Anibal Quijano, modernity, that is what we currently accept to be the historical descriptor of the Americas since 1492, is characterized by European processes that have reimagined humanity via the categories of race, knowledge, and economics, i.e. white supremacy, Eurocentric reason, global market capitalism. Under this guise, all of humanity is linearly represented as a historical development from a state of nature to the modern European person. This epistemic assumption, the knowledge assumption of European modernity, of the European modern project, all right, projects European being as the highest representation of human culture and civilization. The preconditions for these reconfigurations, Quijano argues, are theological in nature. Quijano associates the problem of modernity with the Christian imagination of soul and body. Soul-body dualism is significant because it is the basis for determining who is a Christian subject in the modern world. Therefore, who is a human in the modern world? The soul, from this perspective, this is Quijano's argument, is above the body and is the material active in Christian consciousness. When one is governed solely by the body, they are acting from the state of nature and are suffering from the effects of an underdeveloped soul. Or, as the Pauline scripture reads, they are walking after the flesh and not after the spirit. On their own, these epistemic assumptions are benign. Right? That's important. Soul-body dualism becomes a problem for Quijano when they are used to construct the image of non-Europeans. He says, soul-body dualism is used to label non-Europeans, right? And in this labeling, it functions to corroborate the ideology of race with the science of evolution. So we can see this dualism working in the valid debates of the 16th century, those debates over the humanity of the Amerindians and how they should be treated by Bartolomé de las Casas, right? That's Sepulveda, right? The debates are lasting examples of how the Eurocentric episteme was unable to grant a priori assumptions about the humanity of non-Europeans, right? The fact that the humanity of the non-European was debated, right, affirms Quijano's theory concerning the coloniality of power and Eurocentrism. It is the European, for Quijano, and the European alone, excuse me, who had the reason and the elevated soul to determine whether or not the humanity of the Africans and the Amerindians are equal to or lesser than the European. Quijano's coloniality of power and Charles Long's critique of the myth of civilization, primitivism work together to carve out a space for me to consider coloniality as a theological challenge. And taking up coloniality as a theological challenge, the aim is not to offer a new model of critical theory or a new foundation for liberation theology that can set up a new universalist space. As Catherine Walsh and Walter Mignolo have asserted in their recent publication that came out in June, I believe, entitled On Decoloniality, such a move would only reify the colonial matrix of power, repeat it. As such, decoloniality in my theological project is not aimed at decolonizing the Americas built by colonialism. Instead, as Mignolo and Walsh argue, decoloniality and thus a decolonial theology is a perspective, a way, an option, a standpoint, an analytic, a project, a practice, or a praxis. And they stress this pluriversality, where we should not be looking to repair an overarching universal for the world, but that we should recognize how local universals can be in relation to others and repair the relationships rather than try to force one overarching universal. With Quijano's theory of coloniality, I've been able to deal with what I see as an impasse in the lives of peoples who I call kin, African-American Christians, mainly within mainline Protestant churches. As a member of this community, I argue that the future of our faith requires a revaluation of both the positive and negative adoptions of the ideology of race as a source for theology. So I'm critical of James Brown, say it loud and black on brown, for some reasons. Good, I hope good reasons. Right? The theologies that have been produced in conversation with US Black experiences of racial oppression and their myriad of intersections have remained fairly ambiguous about the potential option of removing racialized experience from the list of theological sources. Dolores Williams is one of the first thinkers to recognize that the bracketing of racial experience as an option, right? When she, in her phrase, wilderness experience, or her idea of wilderness experience, right? She gave 6 corresponding reasons. I'm not gonna read all 6, I promise. Right? To replace Black experience, but I'll read this most poignant statement that she says about Black experience. More than wilderness experience, more than Black experience, provides an avenue for Black liberation theologians, feminist theologians, and womanist theologians to dialogue, to the earlier point, right, about the significance of the wilderness and what each identifies as the biblical tradition most conducive to the work of his or her theological enterprise. While Black liberation theologians lift up the Exodus liberation tradition as foundational, they have forgotten to give serious attention to the wilderness experience in the Exodus story, in which ex-slaves grumbled, or of course, as my project says, they sang the blues against God and wanted not to bear responsibility for the work, consciousness, and struggle associated with maintaining freedom. Williams is focused on the wilderness of Israel in the Exodus, and of course, the most poignant story she tells about her analogy with Hagar in the wilderness after her banishment from Abram and Sarah, right, her masters, shifts the focus from God's salvific activity on behalf of innocent victims to God's participation in the struggle of people to rebuild a community in the wilderness. And this is my last point. How a spatial reading of the blues is a foundation for doing a decolonial theology. Similar to the wilderness experiences, the blues works as an epistemic framework, a framework of knowledge, a pre-theological material, and thus provides tools for building community. In distinction from Williams, my focus is on how blues peoples take responsibility for how the sensual, the sonic, and the land, the 3-part cosmology there, as image as a basis for interpreting and living dignified lives. These things are not wooden or plastic, they move, they shift, they're in flux, right? But these are at least the starting point. For people overdetermined by the forces of plantation ideology, that is the structure of power that ruled the South when cotton was king, right? In the US, the blues people regularly encounter the forced wilderness that is American Jim Crowism, both old and new. As critical geographer Clyde Adrian Woods has so powerfully argued, the blues is an arrested development of a vision for human life that looked to develop an option amid precarious conditions enforced by the plantation regime of power. I see this regime of power as part and parcel of the coloniality of power, particularly with respect to the economic portion of the matrix. Amid these circumstances, the self-organizing and direct democratic self-governance of blues peoples who were organized before the Emancipation Proclamation and hit the ground running and gave landowners a fit when they refused to do gang labor, right? As a whole, decolonizing revelation clarifies the spatial impacts of the blues episteme and how it posits an option for life. The blues idiom operates as a foundation from which those blues peoples of the US can arrive at a confession of faith that affirms the presence of God in the sounds of their moans, in the sensual embrace of one another's bodies, and the restoration of the relationships with the divine presence of God in the soil, that earth that so many ancestors were forced to call home. the Mississippi Delta.
So we'll open the floor to questions.
Could you elaborate on say a lot on black and brown?
Yeah. So this is an argument that I'm getting from a sociologist by the name of Paul Gilroy. Gilroy's project, and I am in agreement with him, is saying that the problems that we keep encountering, racial bias, right? Overt, covert acts of racism, can only be dismantled when racial ideology is brought to a close, right? It's a far-reaching goal, right? So some people would react problematically to say, like when President Obama took office, that we're in a post-racist society, correct? Or we're in a post-racial society. So he says that if we continue to have to hold on to our coalitional, our community building dependency on race to organize, right? That we inevitably put ourselves in a place of causing the people who we want to see us react to us with the same ideological assumption in mind. So you hear the reaction, right? Blue lives matter in response to Black lives matter, or all lives matter in response to Black lives matter, right? What is the reaction? Black lives matter says something that should be a redundant conclusion. There's a human, and a human should matter. But as that universal has been coded into the colonial project, right, it has forced people to use racial ideology as a positive indicator of, like, to react to the degradation of racism, right? An association of the Black with the privilege, as I said before. So while it is helpful, Gilroy argues, right, for organization purposes, for self-love and self-affirmation, it still traps us in the ideology, right, that keeps the conversation from being able to happen. So that's what I love to say, and I got all of that good stuff out of it, right? But I have been challenged by these thinkers to kind of pick this up, because you can't build coalition when everybody's doing comparative oppressions, right? And so we need an integrative analysis, right, that we can share. And so I'm willing to make the wager when that dialogue is robust and thick, so that when we come to the table, I'm not giving up what I have pride in, the blues, right, for the sake to participate in and participate in the analytic. Right? Oh,
Dan.
That was remarkable.
thank you so much.
And I was wondering if, as you were listening to the conversation on El Salvador,
Right.
do you have thoughts on how you might connect the two discussions?
Yes, I mean, taken with the idea that I'm in a learning mode at this conference mostly. One of the things that struck me from the panel that referred to the youth being associated with the gangs on the basis of gender, right? They're male, they're young, gang, right? And the kind of policing that happens around that, right? I think this is the legacy of the logic, right, of the primitive and the civilized, right? It's the legacy of the logic of evolutionism. It's the legacy of the logic of Descartesian mind-body dualism. Now, like I said, like Deepesh Chakrabarty, the critical theorist who says we need to provincialize Europe, we don't need to do away with Europe, right? Europe, I'm not saying that Europeans are all bad and that non-Europeans are all good. I'm saying that the universal that governs knowledge and how one makes sense of the material reality through the disciplines, right, cannot tell everyone who they are, right? That there needs to be a sharing in that conversation. And so I think with the dynamics in El Salvador, that's what's at the that's the nuts and bolts of the problem, is that the government has, in the other conversation about how the former guerrillas are now the stateswomen and statesmen, right? In some ways, this is a question about the failure of the left, right? To have a project that was outside of the dominant ideology, right? That they had to infiltrate. For my tradition, it is the civil rights movement. There are places in the Mississippi region where you had movements that did not want suffrage. It had been Mound Bayou, Mississippi is an example. And then you had a chance to do any study on Mound Bayou. Jefferson Davis's plantation, right, when at the end of the Civil War, was confiscated by the Union troops, right? And Isaiah Montgomery was one of the descendants of the former slaves of that particular plantation in Mound Bayou. At emancipation, all of the descendants of the enslaved moved in there, and they had a self-sustaining society. It was disrupted, and when the railroads came in, they reorganized on railroad land. I say this to say, when the activists came in from the north to get everybody to go to the polls in Mississippi, when the Freedom Riders came, Mount Bayou didn't want any part of this. They said, we have the land, and we just want you to leave us alone. As long as we have the land, we'll take our chances. That's a narrative that is under-resourced or under treated when you start thinking about race. Why? They are supplanting the racial organization around suffrage, which reifies race in a powerful way, right? Black folks have to organize and go to the poll and build coalition. They're not a large enough voting bloc necessarily in a federal, at the national level to kind of, right? So they have to make some wages, right? Even on the local level, they make some wages. This conversation earlier about negotiation versus dialogue, yes. So yeah, I do think that there's dynamics there.
Yeah. In terms of the appeal to the blues, I mean, the thing that first comes to mind, and you mentioned it many times here, is Cone.
Yeah.
I know you know at least a little bit about, right? Okay. And so I'm just kind of wondering your reading of Cone in terms of, if you read him 20 years after Black Theology Liberation, his reading of his earlier self is that he was too bound by European models of theology, Moltmann, Barth. But he saw his engagement with the blues and the spirituals with, early womanist theology as sort of kind of freeing him from that. And so I'm wondering with, a book like The Cross and the Lynching Tree, his later stuff, is part of your thesis more or less he's still bound? Like he's still too much in the traditional European framework that's set by modernity, or that's, in modernity. Is that sort of where you're kind of driving here?
Yeah. Before he passed away, God rest his soul, we talked about it. I was scared out of my wits. But we had the conversation, and so he asked me, where are you from? You talk about the blues, where are you from? I said, I'm from Mississippi. He said, oh, okay, now I understand. so like that assumption was already, I was like, okay, whoa, what just happened here? It's like we did time travel. But anyways, I asked him, did you go to the juke joints when you lived in Arkansas, right? He said, oh no, I listened to the blues. But I didn't go to, no, there was killing, shooting, gambling and things over there. I was nervous about that, right? So not to, throw Cone under the bus in any way. I think this is a valid position that he has. And it's speaking to a community, right? This is not just two theologians, talking shop, right? His community in Bearden was very much a way of creating this beloved community that King was talking about. And he said, this is the community that nurtured me, this is the community that built me. And he was responding to that community. I'm saying that what troubles me in the spirituals and the blues, and then in his picking up of the blues, is that where is the kind of epistemic shift, right, to the blues life way? In Spirituals and the Blues, he says that the blues could not have given the civil rights movement the hope that it needed to push forward, right? While the blues is important, and I think it's very, very valuable, it could not have done that. Well, here is Clyde Wood saying that it was the basis of self-organizing activity in the South, right? But that's not what Cone was saying. So he was choosing a particular type of self-organizing activity, right, to contribute to the spirituals, right, and their offering, and saying that the blues has another offering that doesn't necessarily tell us about where we should go as a people politically, right? So that's where I kind of like see it with Cone. I'm sure people will quarrel with me, but that's where I am right now.
So I had thank you, Rufus. This is really amazing, very helpful. But I want to ask two questions or make two comments. One is about the spatiality of land, and the second is about the violence of the cross. You ended with, a plea to think about the earth, the soil, and the Mississippi Delta. And I think land, my own work from Latino theologians, being bound to land, being a displaced person, being taken from land has all been very important. I think in our discussions in Romero days, those of us who don't live in El Salvador, we frequently have to look at the map, right? The farther you go down into these fine-grained studies about department to department, this pueblo versus that pueblo, the more you get a sense of la realidad. So spatiality is really a great hermeneutic. My question, however, has to do with the Delta is not just land, it's opening up to the sea. And in terms of the Black Atlantic, I did some work on Peter Claver in Cartagena, but in terms of the Black Atlantic, don't you have to rethink that spatiality in terms of the intersection of land and sea and where the slave trade came in? So that's one question. Sure. The second question, just talking about the critique of Williams of the violence of the cross, and all the discussion we had here in the last day or so about the spiraling of violence, gang on gang violence, the implicit forms of violence that come from the state that mimic the gangs and draw upon the gangs and all that. I wonder what Williams would think about this phrase of Romero, the violence of love. It is tied to a kind of substitutionary atonement, but it's also speaking to the bullet that ultimately would kill him and how to fight back and how to forgive your enemy. Is the violence of love implicit in a colonialist logic, or is the violence of love a kind of non-passive agency in the midst of conflict, or both, or neither? Just wonder what your thoughts were about Romero's plea to consider the revealed truth of the violence of love.
So just a clarifying question to the violence of love piece. Romero is saying that the acceptance of violence, or the engagement rather of violence, can be a part of love.
No, I don't think Romero was a post-colonial or decolonial thinker. I'm not trying to say that, but I'm trying to say that he saw the violence around him, he saw the spiraling of violence around him, and he responded in his homilies by preaching the love of Christ. But he needed to, just like we were talking about before, when he used the idiom human rights, that was kind of a universal language, right? And that was very important to him. As our earlier speakers noted, that can't be denied or taken away from his witness. And that brings another set of questions. But In terms of revelation, it was reading Puebla Medellin, Paul VI, Evangelii Nuntiandi, reading the scriptures, Christ's forgiveness of his enemies. He was preaching as a violence of love.
Well, I don't know if it's gonna be a sufficient answer, but what Williams is trying to do is she's trying to be careful to the trauma that Black women have endured. And in being responsive to that, she's not just saying it's not just a moral move on her account, but she's also saying that God is responsible to them in a certain way. And her shift from looking at the violence implicit in what one must do to show their solidarity on behalf of the people who they're with is a condition that might be necessary, but it is not the active thing that makes the movement of solidarity meaningful. Right? She's saying that it's the creativity of thinking about the oppressed in terms that are unique to their own experience and that push their experience, right? And she's trying to get at the creative activity of what that takes, surviving in the wilderness, right? And so it's not to say that Romero is outside of her hermeneutic. It's just to say that within a kind of decolonial perspective, that these hermeneutics can coexist side by side, right? Not in a kind of relativism, right? But in a kind of acceptance that these folks have experienced this particular trauma, and this access point into the revelation might be re-traumatizing for them, right? Others may see that point, that access point, as affirming because they've taken the bullet, right? They watched their friend die in the street, and they need that paradox. They need that moment to mean something more, right? There's a serious conversation that can happen there between those things without it collapsing into a kind of relativism where everything goes, right? That's where I kind of see her project in response to that question. And about the sea, I would say, yes, of course. The plantation economy doesn't work without the sea, right? And that's just not how the domination works. That's also how the resistance works. When Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, had the revolt, right? It became common conversation, right, in the North, right, amongst Black Americans about organizing, right? And I have a friend, Jarvis McKinnis, who was here for a while. He's now at Duke. He's doing a project on how sugar plantations communicate in Louisiana and some other parts of the U.S. South had circulars. Tracks of communication between plantations in Panama and other places. I'm not the expert on that, so I can't really field the questions on that, but there are these projects where you kind of see the sea being a part of the plantation economy. It doesn't work. And the last thing I'll say in terms of the cosmovision of the sea, there are these narratives of the slaves flying away across the sea back home, right? You hear the songs, I'll fly away, oh glory, I'll fly away, right? The thought was, I believe, attached to an Igbo tradition that made it across the transatlantic about walking out into the sea and moving on back to the east, back home in West Africa. So I think the sea is definitely part of that hermeneutic.
Moving a little bit away from theology for a minute to current events, I've been thinking a lot about the criminalization of young Latino men in the United States due to the language of gangs that has been elevated by the current administration. And it strikes me that some of what we're seeing, it's not the same thing, but there are some similarities between the war on drugs in the 1980s and the war on gangs in El Salvador today, and how that criminalizes a certain portion of the population on the streets of San Salvador, but also now on the streets of Washington suburbs or Long Island or New Jersey. Is there anything that the Latino community could learn, or maybe the Salvadoran community could learn from the unfortunate experience of the war on drugs, and how the language of winning the war on drugs and contributed to the criminalizing of Black youth, Black males in particular in the United States, and how that might be pertinent to the situation that I think increasingly young Latino men are finding themselves in, especially given the fact that, as Foreman's new book, Locking Up Our Own, points out, it was often leaders in the Black community that were not spearheading, but contributing to mass incarceration as a means of trying to do something. It was more a war on guns, but it was still contribution inadvertently to mass incarceration. What could we learn from that?
I think Daniela mentioned this in her presentation. The difference, I think, is important. The war on drugs, the war on guns, is the latest installment of Jim Crow-ism. It's a continuum. So when Black Americans left the US South for the urban centers, in the same way that the Southern plantation owners were, they were not ready to receive those bodies into the civic space. In the South, they were not ready to receive them into the labor space, right? So that piece of the dynamic is the part where I have more questions than I have answers, because I'm not sure if you have that same dynamic with Latino men. It seems to me that the gang culture occupied a space that the state already knew how to deal with, even though the dynamics of how they were interacting with the state through in the conversations they've been having, even though gangs are acting with the state through these overt forms of violence, they're filled into a placeholder that the state is used to dealing with because of how it dealt with the guerrillas, right? And so the state is always going to maintain its best interests. So in many ways, I'm curious about those of you who study left politics and the conversations that are happening now. Are we in a failure of the left, right? Because if we are, then that failure creates the opportunity for anyone or anything to occupy that space of power, right? And as that's happening, I think what decoloniality speaks to this question is, how can we remain vigilant, right, on this project? Now, what's something more concrete, right, to talk about? Last year, the U.S. Social Forum met, I mean, not last year, but in 2015. 2015, the U.S. Social Forum met in a number of cities throughout the U.S. And I had the pleasure of going to Jackson, Mississippi, where a coalition of business owners and activists began this group called Cooperation Jackson, that was kind of a continuation of the Malcolm X grassroots campaign and the Fannie Lou Hamer farm co-op initiative that had connections there. So some of you know the Nation of Islam was trying to build farms in the U.S. South, and Fannie Lou Hamer would build these pig farm co-ops. in the late 1960s with some patronage from some Wisconsin folks, I believe. At any rate, they're trying to rebuild that in downtown Jackson. Young people, 12, 13, 14 years old, were leading talks, talking about local histories and global designs. They were talking about the coloniality of power and handling it. And they were applying it to why they needed to have their own food sources. They were applying it to how they could use their self-organizing activity to build permaculture farms, to build art centers for artists to come in and build an alternative community that would be resistant to the Jackson project to take over the city and gentrify it. So they worked to build land grants that blocked certain blocks of downtown Jackson from being taken over by gentrifying forces. These types of programs and initiatives, I think, are where the learning can happen and where the options can happen. There must be some reorganizing option for life. And I think it must be attached to these very basic things: soil, right, ground, land, sea. And we need cultural production to reify these things, right? And that always gets problematic because cultural production always gets co-opted for, commercial sales, things like that. So I'd be vigilant about that too.
One last one. I think your conversation about the blues is a good prelude to my conversation about gangs and hip hop that I'm doing tomorrow.
Sure.
In the morning.
Yes.
A little commercial tomorrow.
Be there or be square.
So what do you think about it's part of the root.
Yeah.
The blues is the root. So
Yeah.
what do you think about hip hop?
Well, I just recently finished an article that's going to be published with Fordham Press in a book chapter on Sylvia Winter. And I talk about this Mississippi rap artist named Big Crit. Big Crit is evoking the blues in the rap idiom. He's not the first. You can think about some Texas rappers. Some of you may know UGK or Bun B, and of course he has this other rapper has a very misogynistic name, and I apologize for it, but his name was Pimp C. He said something very interesting about this nexus of hip hop, and it's connected to this blues thing. He said, we in the South don't have hip hop. We're rapping country rap tunes. So in my blues classes with some of the students at Notre Dame before I left, we looked at this sonic tradition and tried to give them access. It's a starting point for a conversation. That if this idiom can survive in this medium that you think as young folks knowing this rap idiom or hip hop idiom, right? Do you know that this comes out of a political reality, right? That it is Black and brown when it comes out of the Bronx, right? That it is also about LGBTQ communities too, because they got it from the music that they sampled was from the disco, right? In this space as well. So and that's not to muddy the waters too much, but I do think that once you have that exercise of taking responsibility for an idiom, then they have the visceral experience with taking responsibility for something that's a little bit more pithy and weighty in terms of like creating a politic or creating a new foundation for Christian faith that restores something of themselves that they can see in the faith claims that they're making. So yeah, I look forward to tomorrow.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know we have some undergraduates here. Would those of you who are undergraduates, do you have any questions? Do you feel comfortable stepping forward and putting your questions Well, I suppose I can, just one question forward, or ask if you could say something about, actually a passage from the, text from the first chapter. You mentioned that, let's see, the focus on poverty often resulted in covering over the importance of non-Western conceptions of time and space operative in the diverse communal lifeways, those summarily classified as the poor. Leading from decolonial thought, the question I want to approach is whether or not salvation history, albeit a history situated in the world of the poor, is commensurate with notions of history that are indigenous to the Americas. And so, I guess before we conclude, I was wondering if you could say more about the importance of the epistemic decolonial shift, or the importance of epistemology, whether with respect to theology, or with respect to what you've seen, what you've heard about the gangs during this conference. Where could you foreground the epistemological element a bit more, especially the notions of history that are indigenous to the Americas? And as part of this too is a question for everybody. How do we tap into the non-state, non-Eurocentric ways of thinking and experiencing life? Because it does seem that a lot of what we see across the board, even in relation, the relationship between the gangs and the state, for instance, is a recapitulation of coloniality on many different levels. And it seems like the epistemology is at least one front that on which there needs to be an advance in order to get beyond the coloniality that we're experiencing, whether we're experiencing it through we call racism, or experience it as it's recapitulated in gang violence, or is it certainly recapitulated in state violence, whether it's in a Latin American state or a North American state. So could you just say something about epistemology in that? Because now this is the one last thing. What I heard in your comments about Jackson was that they're actually trying to think in a way that is outside, to a certain degree, the bounds of coloniality. So the epistemic question is what I'm interested in.
Yeah. The short of it is, I know we're running short on time. Short of it is that whenever you have a reaction to an event that is produced by the state, the usual, or an event that's oppressive, right? So racism, gentrification, any of the things that we can name here. The usual tools that we pick up are moral and ethical, right? Or we use the moral and ethical to shame the economic and the fiscal as a response, right? The epistemic fight is there, right? Epistemic resistance, or decoloniality and delinking, is trying to say that that reaction has to be extremely careful, right? I'll give you an example. It's a historical example, but I think it's clear. When Nat Turner, those of you know the revolutionary Nat Turner, who started the slave revolts, right? When they revolted, right? We think about Nat Turner he asked this question, was he moral? Was he ethical? Was he violent? Was he guilty of murder? But the question that decolonial theory is asking us to ask is, in what way is Nat Turner a moral subject? In what way is Nat Turner an ethical subject? If we're going to cast some responsibility on him to resist oppression in the terms that don't reify some structural violence, then we have to also ask, is his subjectivity capable, right? Not as an assessment of better or worse, right? Right. But does he have a subjectivity that the state respects? That he could do something otherwise, right? This to me is very pertinent with the gang culture, right? If the gangs are going to inhabit a different subjectivity, will the state interact with them through that new subjectivity, right? And the usual answer to this that comes from the economic and the fiscal response, or the moral and the ethical response, is we'll negotiate with you, right? To use the terms that are already in the air from the room, right? But decoloniality and delinking asks, can we think about this question from a different perspective? And this is where I think, in terms of this group, in my involvement with this group, this is very personal to me at this point. Latin American liberation theology has been critiqued by Black theologians, and the people of Latin America have been critiqued by Black folks for not being concerned about the issues of race. Folks in the North have been, in the US North, Blacks in North America have been critiqued that a part of the agrarian reform movement and so forth, right? I think that decoloniality and the epistemic focus, that is, the assumptions that we make about what a subject is, what a person is, own cultural basis that may regenerate or reimagine some indigenous knowledge, right? Because some of these things are lost. The Taínos were almost wiped out, right? Right? But some reimagining that can then be a kind of push-off point, right? So that we can repair this need to negotiate. And when we negotiate, we give up the epistemic ground. When we negotiate with epistemics of ethics and morals, and we don't clarify subjectivity, right? We don't have a way of thinking about a Nat Turner as someone who is doing something very moral, very ethical, and very loving in that moment, right? Because of how limited of a space he has, right, to be respected as a human being. Right? Now, again, of course, the reaction I recognize in using him as an example is, well, he stopped someone from living. That's a problem, Rufus. Like, what are you going to do with that? In bracketing that, I think that's where the epistemic work has to go. Then we can pick up, maybe there can be some other option, but we also got to recognize that he's not a subject in that moment that has the capacity to do that. And a lot of decolonial theorists talk about the anti-ethical action, that is in itself what needs to be done, but will not be read as ethical.
Any means necessary.
Maybe. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I look forward to it.